Good day. Today is Sunday, 11th August, and we're now into the 5th day of Ukraine's offensive in Kursk region. And I think it's becoming increasingly clear, even Ukrainian commentators are very, very grudgingly coming to accept the fact that the offensive is beginning to run out of steam. There have continued to be attempts by the Ukrainians to get things moving again, and this takes the form of what are referred to both by Ukrainians and Russians as sabotage and reconnaissance groups, small groups of troops, sometimes in wheeled vehicles, moving fast across the countryside, trying to create an appearance of the Ukrainians being present in every location, all of this accompanied by a major campaign of publicity and agitation of that kind. But anyway, it's clear that this is not, in fact, having the desired effects, at least on this occasion, and the Russians are gradually and methodically, as they always do, bringing the situation back under control. Now, here at this point, I want to repeat a point I've made now in 2 consecutive programs, but I want to make it again. It's sometimes possible to take the Russians by surprise, as perhaps happened on this occasion with this attack in Kursk region, but it is almost impossible to get them to panic. And what we have seen is that after an initial flurry of uncertainty, the Russians have gradually recovered their balance. They've been bringing more and more troops into the area, and the situation is gradually being brought under control. Now, I say all of this, I have to say that there is an alternative view, and it is one that I have been reminded of by a very important source who regularly contacts me, who describes to me the situation on the various battlefronts and the thinking in Moscow, and has done so with consistent accuracy. Now, according to the views of this person, the Russians, not just the views, but the information this person has, and he has been a consistently reliable source of information. According to this person, the Russians have had wind that the Ukrainians were intending to conduct some kind of cross-border operation in Russia for some time, that the Russians, far from wanting to prevent that happening, were prepared to let it happen, that they let the door open, in a sense, in specific areas along the border, Kursk region being one, knowing that the Ukrainians would be unable to resist the temptation to take advantage of what they saw as a weakening of the Russian position on the border. The Ukrainians would then advance across the border, become overextended. The Russians would be able to destroy them in detail, and the process of aggressive attrition, of the destruction of the Ukrainian forces, and specifically of Ukrainian reserves, would be considerably simplified. Now, what makes the information this person has provided me with especially compelling is 2 things. Firstly, he has proved to be a consistently reliable and very well-informed source, very well-informed about discussions that take place in Moscow. The second, as he has pointed out to me, is that he warned me that something like this would happen roughly 2 months ago. He actually contacted me at the time, told me that the Ukrainians were preparing some kind of cross-border raid. He had that information from the Russians themselves, that the Russians were aware of that fact and were going to sit back and let it happen because it played out to their purposes. And I have the emails going all the way back 2 months ago, which verifies that this email exchange actually did take place and that the tip-off was in fact provided. Now, I'm not going to provide more details of this interaction of emails and discussions because, again, I don't want to disclose information about this particular source, which might be inconvenient and embarrassing for him and might help in identifying him. But the fact is, he did provide this information and, well, as he's pointed out, things are playing out very much in the way one might have anticipated. I would add, and this I had completely forgotten, but I would add that this same source pointed out to me before, it was the same source that pointed out to me before, that the Ukrainian objective in the attacks on Belgorod was to capture a storage facility where the Russians, and before that the Soviets, kept tactical nuclear weapons. The fact that that facility exists, by the way, can be confirmed from open sources. And he's again reminded me that there are indeed further such military installations also in the Kursk area, though as we will see in a moment, they are now well outside Ukraine's reach. So all of this information was provided to me by this person 2 months ago. Now, having said that, I still have certain doubts. Firstly, I do wonder whether the very risk-averse Russian military leadership would simply sit back and allow an operation like this to happen, knowing in advance that it would. After all, we are talking about some very sensitive facilities. Let's assume, for example, that a Ukrainian raiding party really did manage to break through and reach and capture the Kursk nuclear power station. What would the Russians have done then? And given that the consistent pattern of Russian activity, at least of the way in which the Russians have conducted the war, is that they don't take unnecessary or foolish risks. They move forward steadily and methodically, one step at a time, very unlike the Ukrainians, by the way. I wonder whether the Russians would have taken a risk of this kind. And the second factor is Putin's own role in all of this. Now, I am assuming that if there was a plan of this kind, Putin would have been a party to it. And I wonder whether Putin would have acted with quite the same degree of ruthlessness that this sort of plan would imply. After all, Putin would have known when he approved the plan that in order to put it into successful effect, the lives of Russian civilians would be lost. Now, Putin can be extremely ruthless, as any political leader in his position from time to time must be. American political leaders, presidents, have been pretty ruthless as well. All political leaders of great powers have to be at some time if they are to advance the interests of their countries. I'm putting that in the most straightforward way, but of course you could come up with another way of describing that. But anyway, would he really have been, however, prepared to sacrifice the lives of Russian civilians in this sort of way? I have to say it does not correspond with my own understanding of the man. I think he's perfectly capable of giving instructions for an adversary of Russia, somebody who is a danger to Russia as he sees it. And of course, a danger to Russia would be a danger to Russia's government as well. I can imagine that he would give instructions for a person like that to be eliminated. But is he the kind of person who would allow the lives of Russian civilians to be put in jeopardy for such an objective? I have to say I have difficulty believing this, but then that's my view, and I accept that war is a pretty ruthless affair, and to all intents and purposes, this is a war, and maybe Putin was prepared to act in this very ruthless and, dare I say it, cold-blooded way. Anyway, I throw this out there. I did get this email exchange. I was given this warning 2 months ago. It does correspond fairly closely with the events that we have seen, and it could be that there is some sort of Russian plan at work, despite what some might say is compelling reasons to accept this theory. I'm going to say straightforwardly that I still have some doubts. But there it is. I lay it out for you. It is for you to make up your minds. And in the meantime, we have to deal with the situation that we have playing out at the moment. Now, over the last 24 hours, and I think this is a key thing to say, the fighting in Kursk region has considerably abated. There's been a lot less fighting. The Ukrainians have been making fewer attempts to break through. They have dispatched sabotage groups or reconnaissance groups in all kinds of directions, again, to try to shake the Russians and perhaps also to achieve momentary breakthroughs. But it's clear that these attempts overall have been unsuccessful. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has provided us its latest update about what has been going on. I'm not going to read it in any detail. All I will say is that it gives us more clues as to where some of the fighting has been taking place, and specifically it gives us some clues as to where the Ukrainians have been conducting their latest attempts to send reconnaissance groups. The relevant paragraph, as far as I'm concerned, is this one, and it's almost the first one. Over the past 24 hours, as a result of active actions by the North Group of Forces North and arrived reserves, army aviation and unmanned aerial vehicles and artillery, attempts by enemy mobile groups, that's to say reconnaissance groups, on armor to get to the depth of Russian territory near Tolpino, Zhuravli and Obshy Kolodets have been repelled. So this is what the Russian Defense Ministry tells us. Now, if you go to the map, you will find where these various villages are, and it's important to stress that the Russians are not saying that the Ukrainians control these villages. On the contrary, it's clear from this report that it is the Russians who control these villages. These were mobile groups that the Ukrainians sent in armored vehicles dashing across the country roads, trying to get as far as possible. Tolpino is located near to the village of, in fact, to the northeast of the village of Korenevo, which the Ukrainians have tried unsuccessfully to capture. Zhuravli is located somewhere, some distance eastwards, and the other place, Obshy Kolodets, is located north of Zhuravli. So what basically happened is that the Ukrainians, having failed to capture Korenevo, appear to have sent two groups of two reconnaissance groups, one advancing to try to outflank the Russian positions at Korenevo, the other pushing north from Zhuravli, and ultimately getting defeated along the way, probably near Obshy, Kolodez, and Zhuravli itself. The Russians, note again, are saying that the Ukrainians tried to get to the depths of the Russian territory near Tolpino, Zhuravli, and Obshy, Kolodez. They were thwarted, which to my mind must mean that the Russians actually control these villages. I say that because I predict, as night follows day, that people will claim that this report admits that these villages, these three villages, have in fact been captured, and it's clear to me that they have not been. And there's also been a significant Russian advance towards Suja itself. Lots of reports by many sources, Ukrainian, Russian, neutral, that Suja has been captured by the Ukrainians, which is now, I think, clearly and widely understood to have been untrue. And there were also account reports that Suja had been surrounded, that a Russian force in Suja had been trapped and was in a cauldron. And the military summary channel this morning has provided a very complicated account of a very complicated battle in and around Suja, suggesting that the Russians have broken that encirclement of that group in Suja. Now, I'm going to say straight away, it may be that the battle was indeed as described by the military summary channel. Again, I get the sense that a lot of the account of this battle is provided by the Ukrainians. It seems to me rather more likely that this is the description of this battle is an attempt to reconcile different narratives. Ukrainian sources have placed Suja either under complete Ukrainian control or have claimed that the Ukrainians were located in positions in eastern Suja. And it may be that the Ukrainians were never there at all, and that this entire battle, as it's been described, is essentially a fiction. I am not sure. I don't pretend I know. I am not there. All I will say is it seems clear that the Russians do control eastern Suja. And it is also clear that the Russians have taken fully under their control the village of Martinovka, which is located to the northeast of Suja, which is located, based on the main road to Kursk. Now, again, I say that apparently there are claims by the Ukrainians that they control a part of the village of Martinovka. From General Alaudinov, the Chechen general, says that the Russians are in full control of Martinovka. And I've seen film which shows Russian soldiers moving in Martinovka, and it seems to me clear that the Russians control Martinovka, which means that the access routes to Suja from the east are fully under Russian control, and that the Russians have secure communications. In fact, the main road, which allows them to communicate, to arrive, to reinforce their forces in Suja itself, and to send supplies there. And I'm going to suggest this has been the major Russian priority now. The nuclear power station further north, near Kursk, is now, so far as I can see, firmly secure. There is, I would have said, no realistic possibility that the Ukrainians will be able to get that far. Yesterday, I spoke about how there had been reports that the Ukrainians had managed to get significantly north of Suja, that they'd reached a place called Kromskie Biki. It seems that this place might have been, again, reached by a Ukrainian reconnaissance group. It's clearly on the way, if I can put it like this, towards the nuclear power plant. And indeed, all of these operations around the village of the other village of Korenovo are were clearly intended to provide another pathway to the nuclear power plant. But both of those pathways have been blocked, and that attack towards this village north of Suja was clearly unsuccessful. The Ukrainians were unable to reach Kromsky, or at least unable to capture Kromsky Biki. And yesterday, as it happens, the Russian Defense Ministry said that there'd been a battle in a village called Ivanivshka, which clearly is on the way to Kromsky Biki. So that was probably the route followed by this reconnaissance group, and probably close to where it was actually destroyed. And there were reports yesterday that the Russians have now begun an operation to recapture another village called Malaya Loknia, directly north of Suja, which if the Russians recapture it, which I'm sure they will, that will not only secure another line, another relief line towards Suja, but it will enable the Russians to start to take further action to repel the Ukrainians around the other village of Korenovo. So anyway, that is the nature of the battle. But as I said, there was a significant reduction in the fighting yesterday, and we got the sense of this from the level of losses that the Russians are claiming that the Ukrainians have suffered in this area over the last 24 hours. The Russians say that the Ukrainians, this is the number of troops that they say that the Ukrainians lost in this operation. They say that they lost 230 troops, killed and wounded, 38 armored vehicles, including 7 tanks, 3 Striker armored personnel carriers, 1 infantry fighting vehicle, 28 armored fighting vehicles, 7 motor vehicles, 4 field artillery systems, 1 Buk M surface-to-air missile system, the 3 launchers and 1 radar system of a Patriot anti-aircraft missile system. And then they give us total losses for the Ukrainians in this area. And since the 6th of August, according to the Russians, the Ukrainians lost 1,350 men, dead and wounded, 29 tanks, 23 armored personnel carriers, 9 infantry fighting vehicles, 116 armored fighting vehicles, 20 motor vehicles, 3 self-propelled guns, 3 self-propelled, Buk M surface-to-air missile systems, 3 launchers and 1 radar station of a Patriot anti-aircraft missile system. That, by the way, to my mind, effectively means that the entire Patriot missile system is destroyed, and 1 Grad multiple launch rocket system. So the Ukrainians are stopped, slight reduction in losses. They're not making any progress. From now on, it'll be a case of a steady build-up by the Russian forces in the Kursk region until the Russian forces in this area become all overwhelming, and the Ukrainian forces start to break down. And I ought to say that there are also reports. I've mentioned the two reconnaissance groups that the Ukrainians tried to send, one towards Tolpino, the other northward towards this other place to through Zhuravli to Obshy Kolodez, and how the Russians destroyed it. There was apparently another attempt by another reconnaissance group further south, well to the south of Suja, also to cross the border and to move towards a another small town called Belova, and apparently that was defeated, and that the Ukrainians lost 2 tanks, 1 armored fighting vehicle, 1 field artillery gun, and 2 ammunition vehicles in this area as well. So anyway, a confusing battle, but as I said, it's clear to me that gradually, step by step, the Russians are bringing the situation under control. The Ukrainians still trying to send men and machines, pushing in various directions. But gradually, steadily now, the initiative is swinging back to the Russians. Now, the logical thing, as I've discussed at this point, would be for the Ukrainians to call it quits, say, make up a story that the offensive has been a great success, that it has shaken the Russians to the core, that it's alarmed Putin. There have been some really extraordinary claims about Putin himself, claims that people trying to study his face at the meeting where he was getting the report from General Gerasimov, for example, to make out that he was supposedly upset or distressed or furious. There's an article claiming this in Moscow Times, for example. Anyway, the Ukrainians could spin more of these stories, and they could pull out of Kursk, and they could say that this operation has been a tremendous success, despite the fact that, as I said, they've suffered very substantial losses. 29 tanks, 1 almost complete Patriot missile system, 3 Buk M1 surface-to-air missile systems. As I said, this is proving already to be, in lives and machines, valuable machines in very short supply. It's proving to be a very costly operation indeed. Going back to what that person who contacted me the other day said, if you are talking about aggressive attrition, effectively, the Ukrainians through this operation have inflicted significant aggressive attrition upon themselves, and for the moment all they have to show for it are a couple of villages. But they did capture some of these villages. They did enter Suja. They did occupy the offices of Gazprom, though it seems that they have not actually successfully captured the actual pipeline facility. The office and the pipeline facility are located in different parts of Suja, and the part of Suja where this facility is located appears to be still under Russian control. I say that, I'm not absolutely sure of this, but I would have thought that if the Ukrainians really were in control of this facility, they would have provided pictures to confirm this. I've seen no such pictures, and reports from the Russians seem to suggest that the facility is still under Russian control. Anyway, put all that aside, the Ukrainians could pull out, and they could say that it has been a tremendous success. It has destabilized and wrong-footed the Russians. It might, for all I know, cause a brief revival in morale in Ukraine. It might impress some people in the West. It might result in some good articles, from a Ukrainian point of view, good articles appearing in the Western media talking about the prowess of the Ukrainian army. They could do all of that. But following the meeting that Zelensky had with his top military people, entirely predictably, they are doing something completely different. They're doing the diametric opposite. There are reports this morning which say that the Ukrainians have decided that they're not going to try to advance further deeper into Russia. They're admitting, in other words, that the Kursk nuclear power plant is now out of their reach, which it obviously is, but that the Ukrainian troops have been given orders to try to consolidate. Consolidate how? How are they going to consolidate in these villages that they've captured on Russian territory? I would have thought, with the Russians literally on their doorstep and likely to begin their major counterattack, perhaps in a week's time, perhaps even sooner than that, with the Russians controlling the skies and bombing the Ukrainians relentlessly. There have been reports, by the way, that up to 200 FAB bombs have already been dropped on Ukrainian forces in this precise area. And Iskander missiles have been extremely active and have been doing immense damage to the Ukrainian forces. Well, with all of that, with all of this going on, how did the Ukrainians consolidate and stay for the duration in these border villages, these small border villages that they have captured, trying to hold on to them? All that it's going to do is it's going to result in large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers getting wounded and killed and eventually captured. And at some point, it might take a couple of weeks, but at some point the Russians will successfully push the Ukrainians back. I'm going to make a guess. The priority for the Russians now is to establish a continuous front line in order to secure fully places like Korenovo and the others. Also, the objective of the Russians will be to recapture, or at least to clear Sudzha completely and to bring Sudzha back securely under Russian control. In that case, the Ukrainians will be left controlling a small number of villages between Korenovo and Sudzha, which are of no military significance or value at all. Now, there's been an article in the London Times by Michael Clarke, who often reports on these matters, both for Sky News, I believe, and for the London Times. And it's fair to say that Michael Clarke is generally a very, very fervid and enthusiastic supporter of the Ukrainians. But anyway, he says that invading Russia is Zelensky's riskiest decision. And he goes on to say crack troops have been used for a risky counterpunch to Putin that astonished the world, and the fingerprints of Ukraine's president are all over it. So that might sound promising. But then we start to hear that you can start to get a sense that of Michael Clarke's own doubts. Given Ukraine's manpower and resources problems, Ukrainian commanders were clearly hesitant. His military chiefs were clearly hesitant. Zelensky's desperate to reverse the narrative that Ukraine is losing its war, and he's trying to find a way to halt that dynamic. And this strategic military choice is very much his style, bold and risky. And it will also make some Western leaders queasy, as items of NATO ground equipment are now being used inside Russia, another threshold crossed. If Ukrainian leaders had asked for Western permission in advance, they wouldn't have got it, so they went ahead anyway. Well, that might be true, and it might not. There's different views about this. And then he goes on to say that the plan is risky, as Moscow has no choice but to do whatever it takes to snuff out this incursion. And then there is a completely false analogy, in my opinion, with the American landing in 1950 at Incheon during the Korean War, which I'm not going to explore. But all I will say is that at maximum, he goes on to say, at maximum, Ukrainian forces around Kursk might hope to extend their reach as far as occupying the nuclear power plant. And that's in an article in the London Times. A quid pro quo for Russia's destructive occupation of Ukraine's Zaporozhye plant in 2022. I've said already, that is now almost certainly beyond Ukraine's reach. If it didn't happen within the first 72 hours, there is little prospect of it happening now, just to say. And it then goes on to say, all these objectives will depend on how long and in what way the Ukrainians, this is from Michael Clark, hold on inside the Kursk pocket. And the result is that eventually, at some point, if they stand and fight, they will risk finding themselves under enormous pressure. Russian Air Force flying is intense, combat air supports around and within it, and eventually sheer numbers will eventually tell, this is Michael Clark's article, tell in the fighting to come, and the continued existence of this incursion inside Russian territory will simply be intolerable to President Putin. It's worth pointing out, by the way, when people talk about Russian territory, which of course Kursk region absolutely is, that for Putin himself and for the Russian government, and perhaps for many people in Russia, Donbass is also Russian territory, and that is of course still being fought over. And anyway, just to finish with Michael Clark, he says that Kiev is prepared to risk valuable soldiers and equipment to make some sort of stand. Zelensky's critics will argue that this is a misuse both of the lives of troops and the heavy metal that Ukraine desperately needs further south in Donbass. So there we are. That's clearly an article in the London Times. It wants to be supportive of Zelensky, but it's clear that it can't quite still its own doubts, that it looks like a disastrous misuse or misapplication of resources. And I have to say I agree. And I think military chiefs, both in Moscow and Kiev and in some Western capitals, maybe not all of them, will think the same thing. Can I now go to a completely different article? This is in The Guardian. And it is an article in which The Guardian, which is fervently supportive of Ukraine, has spoken to a Ukrainian official who has discussed the nature of this operation in Ukraine. And the operation, and this official says that one of the purposes of the operation is to get the Russians to divert forces from the other parts of the battlefronts, from Donbass to Kursk, relieving the Ukrainians of pressure. But then we have this admission in it. The official explained there'd been little effect so far on fighting in the east. The situation is basically unchanged. the pressure in the east continues. They are not pulling troops back from the area. The intensity of Russian attacks has gone down just a little bit, of which, by the way, I see no sign. And when asked directly whether capturing the nuclear power plant was an aim, interestingly enough, this official did not deny it. He merely said, we will see how the Kursk operation develops. We absolutely will not cause problems for nuclear security. This we can guarantee, which that tells us that it was in fact the plan to capture the nuclear power plant. Can I just say that over the course of the last 36 or so hours, a video has apparently appeared which the Russian Foreign Ministry says was created by the Ukrainian Special Forces, which purports to show Russia's Foreign Ministry spokesman floating the idea of Russia trading the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in return for a Ukrainian withdrawal from the Kursk region. And that again suggests to me that this was partly the plan all along. I think what we saw was a desire by the Ukrainians to capture the nuclear power plant, force the Russians into negotiation, try to get the Russians to trade the Kursk nuclear power plant for the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and also use those negotiations for a wider ceasefire. Notice that the Ukrainians are not denying that the nuclear power plant was the objective. Notice that they're still saying that it might become one, even though, as I said, it's clearly out of reach. And as for the other objective that they are admitting to, the redeployment of forces from Donbass, they're admitting that it hasn't happened. And we just had this article by Michael Clark in the London Times, which tells us that ultimately, in terms of the Ukrainian presence in these villages, sheer numbers, the sheer forces that the Russians are going to gather in this area over the next days and weeks will ultimately be overwhelming and will be certain to push the Ukrainians back, and that the Ukrainians risk losing valuable men and machines on this venture. So I think that's actually where we are. So as I said, logic says that with the operation having failed, the best thing to do is to withdraw. But Zelensky doesn't withdraw. He decides always to hold on. He's pushed the Ukrainian army into an attack, which makes no military sense. Michael Clark's article essentially tells us this. He might even have played into some plan of the Russians, though I myself am a little skeptical of that. He's, again, through his constant need to go on the attack, to be seen to be holding the initiative, led the Ukrainian army into another costly expedition, which I have to say, it seems to me, is going to end up badly for them. A couple of months ago, I remember when I read the article in Time magazine that appeared about Zelensky in December, and which was extremely negative about him. The article mentioned that Zelensky had actually at that time, sometime in the autumn, given orders to the Ukrainian military to attack the strongly defended Russian city of Gorlovka in Donbass. This is the city close to the Toretsk conurbation, which is now passing under Russian control. the Ukrainian military immediately decided that this plan was irrational and would ultimately fail, and they refused to carry out Zelensky's orders to carry out what they saw as an irrational operation. But of course, in those days, the Ukrainian army was commanded by General Zaluzhny, who was, as we all know, on difficult terms with Zelensky, and who apparently had lots of battles with Zelensky, pushing back against orders from Zelensky that he thought were irrational. Whereas now, the Ukrainian army is commanded by General Syrskyi, much more pliable figure, far more willing to do what Zelensky asks him to do, and also much more politically insecure than Zaluzhny was. Zaluzhny had the strong support of the men of the Ukrainian army. They trusted and believed in him. He had the support of the nationalist brigades. I use a euphemistic word to describe them. They were prepared to obey his orders, and if they got an order from Zaluzhny that contradicted an order that came from Zelensky, well, obviously they went along with what Zaluzhny said rather than what Zelensky said. Now, as I said, Syrskyi is in charge. He's in a much more politically insecure position. And the result is that irrational orders of the sort that the Ukrainian army resisted back in the autumn to conduct pointless offensives against Gorlovka are being acted on and have resulted in this pointless operation in Kursk. Well, there we go. We'll see what happens. As I said, there's still a fair way to go in this. It's likely, all the indications are, as I said, that Zelensky and Syrskyi and Budanov are going to do that which they always do, reinforce failure, send more troops, try to hold on to these border villages, which have in themselves no military value, give further opportunities for the Russians to grind the Ukrainians down in these places, and in the meantime, the Russians continue their operations elsewhere along the line of contact. Now, before I talk about that, just a few things I wanted to say about some of the new technical developments. About 2 weeks ago, I speculated that the Russians would be adding pulse jets to their larger Fab bombs, the Fab 3000 and the Fab 1500, to extend their range. It seems that this is exactly what the Russians have done. There are reports in the Russian media that the Russians have indeed been doing this, and that the use of these engines not only significantly extends the range of these bombs, but further increases their accuracy. Now, there are probably some disadvantages to using pulse jets. One of them is that, well, it adds a little to the cost, though pulse jets are very simple and inexpensive things. But more importantly, pulse jets do create a noise, so the bombs presumably are not silent right over the course of their flight, though it's likely that the engines cut out sometime before they approach the actual target itself is reached. But anyway, the Russians have now significantly extended the range of their Fab bombs. They're starting to use them, and that will make them even more effective than they already are. There are other reports that the Russians are now accelerating production, or rather modernization and refurbishment of their very large fleet of T80 tanks, which are in stock. Apparently, the factory in Omsk takes around a month to convert an old Soviet-era T80 into a modern era T80 with a new gun, new electronic warfare systems, new guidance and all that kind of thing, and drone protection and all of that. Given that the decision to start bringing the T80s back into service was taken some time ago, we're probably going to start seeing a spike of these tanks over the next few weeks appearing on the battlefronts also. And I had another very interesting email from a commentator who discussed the size of the two armies, gave me some very interesting thoughts about the size of the two armies. And his point was that the Russians probably do have an overall, in fact almost certainly do have now, an overall superiority in manpower right across the line of contact, but it is not overwhelming. It's perhaps 55 to 45, that sort of difference. But given the scale of Ukrainian losses, given the fact that even with the ongoing mobilization, the Ukrainians cannot replace these losses, given that Russian losses are continuing to fall, the actual statistics suggest that the level of Russian losses continues to decline, and given that the Russian military continues to grow at a rate of 30,000 men a month, by year's end, the balance will have moved decisively in Russia's favor. We could have, by that point, a 2-to-1 advantage in manpower of the Russians over the Ukrainians, which, as this person pointed out, would be decisive. It would mean that if the Russians wanted to break through in particular parts of the contact line, they would be able to concentrate overwhelming forces, achieve something well above the classic 3-to-1 superiority, and still have more than enough men to hold other parts of the contact line against any kind of Ukrainian attacks. So there it is. That's perhaps the overall trends in the war. The latest economic news from Russia, by the way, is that we now have had zero inflation, apparently for around 2 weeks. This is actually fairly common in the summer, but in the summer weeks, during the summer in Russia, the summer and early autumn in Russia, inflation routinely falls. But the central bank will no doubt nonetheless be pleased that that inflation is indeed falling. And there is some sign that even as the overall expansion of the Russian economy continues, things are going somewhat off the boil, which is exactly what the central bank wants them to do. And again, that suggests that concerns about an inflationary crisis getting out of control in Russia are exaggerated, not that I've ever taken them very seriously myself. Lastly, and this is just before I turn to the military developments, the Ukrainians have scored a huge and completely pointless diplomatic own goal. As is well known, the Russians, the Wagner organization, has been providing significant support to various North African states that are fighting various Islamist insurgencies on their territory. And recently, some of these Wagner troops got caught up in a battle in northern Mali with some insurgents there, and were defeated apparently in that battle and suffered significant losses. Well, the Ukrainians then immediately came out and started bragging that this was largely their work, that they provided training and support to these Islamist or fighters, that they'd even provided some help with drones, and that some Ukrainian suicide drones were used in this particular operation. That predictably has made the Malian government absolutely furious, because it means that Ukraine is now providing military assistance to an insurgency against the government in Mali. The Malian government is apparently now thinking of breaking off relations with Ukraine and has scaled down diplomatic contacts, and it's made some very, very strong protests to the Ukrainian authorities. Other North African states have joined in, and the long and the short of it is that this bizarre and pointless diversion of men and resources to Africa, all it has done is that it has destroyed, probably not just in North Africa, but across the whole of Africa, Ukraine's credit amongst many African states, consolidating again their sympathy with Russia, which might matter ultimately in terms of General Assembly, UN General Assembly votes on the Ukraine issue, if they ever happen again. It's a weird thing to do. One would have thought that Ukraine would want to keep its special forces and its technicians and its drones in Ukraine itself, where they're actually needed, rather than send them across the world to try to hunt down Wagner fighters and engage them in battles in foreign lands. The Ukrainians apparently have been shocked by the African reaction. They've tried to retract their claims that they were involved in this battle at all, and appear to have tried to reassure the Malian government that they're not, in fact, supporting an insurgency against it. But of course, by now the damage has been done, and, well, there it is. Another, as I said, own goal for Ukraine, a country which has never managed to sort out its diplomatic outreach to any nation beyond the West itself. Let's now turn to the situation on the actual Donbass battlefronts. And before I do, can I say again that it is in the Donbass battlefronts that the fighting, this war is now going to be decided. What goes on in a few villages on the Russian border is not going to change the course of the war. If Ukraine had succeeded in capturing the Kursk nuclear power plant, well, that would have been different. But it was a reckless gamble, always unlikely to succeed, and it is now clear that it has not succeeded. So we're stuck fighting for villages across the border, Russian villages across the border, consolidating anger against them in Russia, strengthening the resolve of the Russians to see this war through to its conclusion. And in the meantime, as they fight for control of these villages, which now have purely symbolic significance, they have no military value whatsoever, the Russians continue their remorseless job of cleaning up in Donbass. And that is exactly what the Russians are doing. Now, if we go back about a week ago, before the events in Kursk happened, I was discussing how the Russians have made significant moves near the important fortified town of Vuhledar in the south of Donbass, how they have captured stretches of the road between Konstantinovka, the village of Konstantinovka and Vuhledar, and which affects the supply situation for the garrison in Vuhledar. There are now reports that the Russians, having captured significant stretches of this road and having also apparently captured significant parts of the village of Konstantinovka itself. There are now Ukrainian films which show Russian troops and tanks moving through Konstantinovka towards the central and western parts of Konstantinovka. Anyway, it's clear that this road is now unusable, and it seems that the Russians, having crossed the road, are also moving towards the next supply road further to the west. And as I've said already, if that road is captured, is cut by the Russians, then the supply situation for Vuhledar becomes critical. And whilst it would be wrong to say that the Ukrainian troops in Vuhledar are trapped, they still would have means to withdraw. Nonetheless, it will become very, very difficult to supply them, and more likely than not, more sensible than not, the Ukrainians ought, in theory, to be pulling back from Vuhledar. Though, as I've said many times, the problem with Zelensky is that he doesn't do withdrawals. Again, like many amateurs, he appears to see a sign of withdrawal from an undefendable position as a defeat rather than a correct response to a developing situation. So, thereby risking turning the situation in Vuhledar into a crisis. Anyway, elsewhere, the Russians are also on the move. The Russians, there's now no, I don't think, much argument anymore that the Russians have indeed captured the village of Ivanivka, close to Pokrovsk. And there are more reports today of further fighting in Grodivka, the village along the road from the village of Progress, which the Russians captured a short time ago. The Russians moving steadily towards Pokrovsk. And given that Ukraine has committed its best troops to trying to hold on to villages in Kursk region, which, as I said, are of no military value, there is a critical shortage of men and machines to hold back the Russians in the area of Pokrovsk. Of course, if Pokrovsk itself falls, well, that will be of tremendous significance, breaking the back of Ukrainian defenses in Donbass, or at least massively affecting their supply position. And of course, it would be a far more important event, militarily speaking, than, say, the capture of a small town like Sudzha would be, which the Ukrainians don't seem to have achieved. So just saying. So if we move elsewhere along the battle lines, further west, further east rather, there's lots of reports of fighting in the Toretsk area. Not entirely clear to me what exactly is going on in the Toretsk area, but all of the reports seem to say that the Russians continue their offensive there, that they are now clearing the village of Druzhba, friendship. Russian means for friendship in Russian. Immediately to the east, northeast of Toretsk city. I suspect that before long they will take action to capture the village of Nelipovka, which is located immediately south of Toretsk and north of New York. There are reports that the Russians have captured all of New York, though there are also some reports that the Ukrainians have tried to conduct some kind of counterattack there. And there are also reports that the Russians are pushing westwards from New York towards Alexandropol, aiming to capture the various villages west of New York, linking up with their forces in the Avdiivka Ocheretino area, and further threatening the supply situation for the Ukrainian grouping in Toretsk, which, by the way, in terms of the numbers of brigades, is now quite large, but not large enough, it seems, to slow the Russians down. There's been lots of reports about what's been going on in the Kupiansk area. Russians supposedly making significant progress there, capturing various villages and other positions south of Kupiansk. I'm not going to pretend I follow this battle particularly closely. And in Volchansk, group of forces north, even as it works to parry the Ukrainian advance in Kursk region, it continues to intensify its pressure on the Ukrainians in Volchansk. They're claiming that there's just a few buildings left to capture in the area of the high-rise buildings in Volchansk. Volchansk, if it's captured, important capture for the Russians, opens the way for the Russians to advance on Kupiansk from the north, interrupting Ukrainian supplies to Kupiansk, and conceivably even providing a means for the Russians to start threatening the Ukrainians in Kharkiv itself. And I saw a report yesterday, I think it was in El País, Spanish newspaper, talking about the very difficult situation of the Ukrainian army in Donbass, how it's basically now very much at the end of its tether, and that the Ukrainians supposedly fear a major Russian offensive, another big Russian offensive into Kharkiv region, and that they don't have the forces to repel it, presumably because they're all tied up defending certain Russian border villages in Kursk region. Anyway, we will see how things play out on the various battlefronts. But to repeat again, even a Ukrainian official has admitted to The Guardian that there has been no slackening in the Russian offensive in Donbass, no redeployment by the Russians of troops from Donbass. The nuclear power station in Kursk is out of reach. The Russians are sending their reserves from deep inside Russia. They're gradually building up the pressure on the Ukrainians in Kursk region. The Ukrainians, as I said in my program yesterday, might still have a few tricks, cards up their sleeve. This is obviously an unpredictable situation. But unless through some accident or miracle or stroke of or flash of genius, they managed to capture the Kursk nuclear power station, one can, I think, say that the Kursk operation is not merely a failure overall, but risks turning into a trap, which Zelensky seems keen for the Ukrainians to walk into. Anyway, that's my reading of the situation today as of the 11th of August. Of course, it's early in the day. It may be that over the course of the day, things develop, that the Ukrainians manage to, as I said, pull something else off. I don't know what that can be, but we see that they're still sending reconnaissance groups, moving in various directions, even as the Russians appear to be successfully hunting them down. As I said, as the number of Russian troops in the area builds up, probably, I'm guessing, by the beginning of next week, we will start to see, or the middle of next week, we will start to see the situation stabilize. And then, as I said, the Russian pressure will grow. And then it will become more and more difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to these villages, even as their forces get hammered and smashed to pieces, attempting to do so. Anyway, that is my take on the situation on the battlefronts in Ukraine. Now, I'm going to return briefly again to the situation in the Middle East. Before I finish this program, I've said that contrary to some speculations that I've seen in the media, I see no sign at all that the Iranians are in fact moderating their position or have decided that they're not going to respond strongly to the assassination in their capital by Israel of the Hamas political chief Ismail Haniyeh. And yesterday, the newly appointed Iranian Foreign Minister Ali Bagheri Kani, who I understand has been appointed to that position by the new president, President Pezeshkian, had telephone conversations with the foreign ministers of Belgium and the Netherlands, both of whom appeared to have asked him and Iran to exercise restraint in this situation. And, well, what we learn, and I'm taking this from the Iranian media, is that Ali Bagheri Kani, the Iranian foreign minister, took an extremely hard line. And this is the report we have from the Iranian media. Iran's interim foreign minister says the Islamic Republic will legitimately and decisively make Israel pay for its crimes, including the assassination of Hamas chief Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. In a telephone conversation with Belgian Foreign Minister Hajar Labib on Saturday evening, Ali Bagheri Kani said that the Israeli regime had destabilized West Asia with its strikes on Gaza and Lebanon and its cowardly assassination of Haniyeh on Iranian soil. In line with the defense of Iran's national security, territorial integrity, and national sovereignty, the Islamic Republic of Iran will legitimately and decisively make the oppressive Israeli regime pay the price for its aggression under international law and procedures, as well as the UN Charter. And we're told that Labib, this is the Belgian foreign minister, in response said that Brussels is worried about the deterioration of the situation in the region, as lack of control over the state of affairs could result in a full-blown war. And she then said that Belgium supports the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, and criticised the construction by Israel of illegal settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, and agreed with the Iranians on the need for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. So, very tough line taken by the Iranians in this call. And Bagheri Kani, the Iranian foreign minister, had a further conversation on the same day. These were clearly coordinated calls. The Benelux countries, Belgium and the Netherlands, clearly were put up to call the Iranians to try to get them to back off. Anyway, the Dutch foreign minister, Caspar Veldkamp, also called Tehran, and again, he seems to have got the same reaction. Bagheri Kani told Veldkamp that Western countries would have who lecture others on the defense of human beings and human rights, and should have employed all their capacities in light of the attack on the Al Tabin school in Gaza City's Al Daraj neighborhood. The the Israeli violation of Iran's national sovereignty and security following Haniyeh's targeted killing in Tehran has not received the necessary criticism from European states. Some of them have remained silent in response to Israel's terrorist acts which contravene international law. Unfortunately, certain European states stay silent over the Israeli regime's actions which violate international law and unjustifiably prevent the UN Security Council from investigating Israeli crimes. And then, importantly, he goes on to say, the Iranian foreign minister highlighted Iran's inherent right to respond to Israeli acts of aggression, saying the Islamic Republic of Iran's action will be in accordance with international principles and the UN Charter. It is therefore necessary for the Dutch government to condemn the crimes of the Israeli regime and support Iran's legitimate and decisive action. Well, one can make what one wishes, but the language is uncompromising. It strongly suggests to me that there is indeed going to be a very, very strong Iranian response. And this dithering or talk of restraint or moderation or second thoughts in Tehran that some media reports in the United States and Britain have been talking about, I have to say I see absolutely no sign of it. Note that this is an official, as I said, apparently appointed by President Pezeshkian himself. I cannot see any sign that Iran is looking for some means to pull back, or perhaps, as the Americans would say, back down. So at some point over the next few weeks, when the Iranian response comes, and I've discussed the various possible reasons for Iran's delay, its need to deploy its forces maybe in other Middle Eastern countries, its need to square all its diplomatic bases with its various friends and allies and potential allies, its need to sort out its air defense systems, from which it's supposedly getting help from the Russians. Well, it seems to me that once all of that is exhausted, this big attack on Israel from Iran will come at a time of Iran's choosing, which may be unexpected for the various parties, Israel specifically, but perhaps also to some extent the United States, which will be on the receiving end of it. So we have to wait for that as well. But until that point, I must, at this point now, I must end this program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you'll find lots of amazing things, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. Links under this video to take you to all of these places. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.